أعزائي طلبة المرحلة الثانية، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اليوم محاضرتنا عن البريتونيوم. The peritoneum is a serous membrane that lines the walls of the abdominal and pelvic cavities. That's appear here in red color. Lines the walls of abdominal and pelvic cavities. It also covers or clothes the abdominal organs, covers the organs within these cavities. As in this figure, it covers the liver, covers the stomach, and the small and large intestine. So it is a serous membrane, lines the walls of the abdominal and pelvic cavities, and also covers the organs within these cavities. What are the functions of the peritoneum? It secretes a serous fluid that's called peritoneal fluid, support viscera and keep them in place, store lipid, and transmit blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics for these organs. Peritoneum can be divided into two parts. Parietal peritoneum that lines the walls of the abdominal and pelvic cavities. Visceral peritoneum, from its name, it covers the viscera or the organs. And the peritoneal cavity, it is a potential space that lies between the parietal and visceral layer of peritoneum. And this cavity contains a little amount of fluid which is called the peritoneal fluid. This is that appear in red color, lining the wall of the abdominal and pelvic cavities is the parietal peritoneum. And the visceral peritoneum covering the different abdominal organs. The space in between the parietal and visceral peritoneum is the peritoneal cavity. Here we can see this is the parietal peritoneum, and it is reflected on the posterior abdominal wall covering the different structures. Here we can see in this transverse section that the parietal peritoneum is continuous with that of the visceral peritoneum. And it's the same, the parietal peritoneum on the posterior abdominal wall will be reflected and would form a double layer. This double layer will cover the viscera. So there is a continuity, it's the same layer, parietal and the visceral peritoneum, and this is the peritoneal cavity in between. What is the nerve supply of the peritoneum? This is an important subject. Parietal peritoneum is supplied by the lower 6 thoracic nerve and the first lumbar vein from T7 to 12 and L1. This is the anterior abdominal wall. The diaphragmatic peritoneum, or the peritoneum that lining the diaphragm, is supplied by the phrenic nerve. The peritoneum that is lining the pelvis is supplied by the obturator nerve, while the visceral peritoneum that is covering the viscera is supplied by the same nerve that supplies the viscera, which are autonomic afferent nerve. So we have somatic nerve supplying the parietal peritoneum, and we have autonomic nerve supplying the visceral peritoneum. Here we can see it's the same nerve that supply the anterior abdominal wall from T7 to T8, T9, 10, 11, 12, and L1, also supplying all layers of the anterior abdominal wall. In addition to that, the peritoneum with the pelvis by the obturator nerve, and the diaphragmatic peritoneum supplied by the phrenic nerves. Peritoneal cavity in male, this is a closed cavity, that's it have no communication with the outside, while in female there is a communication with the exterior through the uterine tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. In this figure we can see this is the peritoneal cavity of a male, and there is no connection with the outside, while in female it is regarded there is a connection with the exterior through the uterine tube, through the uterus and the vagina. So there is a risk of spread of infection from the genital tract to the inside of the peritoneal cavity. Why? Because of this connection with the exterior. Intraperitoneal and retroperitoneal. What are these items referred to? Intraperitoneal. When we can say that this organ is intraperitoneal, organ that is almost totally covered with the visceral peritoneum. That's from all its sides, it's covered by peritoneum. Example on this organ is the stomach, jejunum, ileum, and spleen. All these organs are covered by peritoneum from all the sides. We can see here, these are the small intestine. Parts of the jejunum and ileum are totally covered by visceral peritoneum, and it have a mesentery, while the retroperitoneal structure is covered partially by visceral peritoneum. These are the retroperitoneal structure. When we can say that this organ is retroperitoneal, when it lies behind the peritoneum and it is partially covered with the visceral peritoneum. Example on these retroperitoneal structures is the pancreas, ascending colon, descending colon, kidneys, and the suprarenal gland. These are the retroperitoneal organs. Here we can see the kidney, suprarenal gland, inferior vena cava, aorta, the duodenum, except the first inch of the duodenum, the ascending and the descending colon. All these structures are regarded as retroperitoneal organs. We can divide the peritoneal cavity in general into two main parts, the greater sac and the lesser sac. The greater sac, this is the main cavity, and the lesser sac. The greater sac extending between from the diaphragm above to the pelvic cavity below, while the lesser sac, this part of the peritoneal cavity that lies behind the lesser omentum and the stomach, and is bounded superiorly from the diaphragm above and below in between the two layers of the greater omentum. And there is a connection in between the greater sac and the lesser sac through the epiploic foramen or foramen of Winslow. The greater sac can be further divided into two parts by the attachment of the transverse mesocolon into a supracolic compartment and infracolic compartment. Supracolic compartment and infracolic compartment according to the attachment of the transverse mesocolon. These are the two parts of the greater sacs, supracolic and infracolic compartments. نجي إلى مصطلح when the peritoneum duplicate or form a double layer, it will form certain structures. From these structures is the omentum. Omentum is a double layer of peritoneum that connect the stomach, connect the stomach to another viscous such as the liver or the spleen. We have the greater omentum and the lesser omentum. Lesser omentum is connecting in between the stomach and the liver. Here we can see this is the lesser omentum suspending the stomach, lesser curvature, and attaching it to the fissure for ligamentum venosum and porta hepatis, while the greater omentum descending down from the greater curvature of the stomach down and folded upward to be attached to the transverse mesocolon. We can appreciate that from this picture that the greater omentum contain certain amount of fat. So the greater omentum connects the greater curvature, this is the greater curvature of the stomach, descend down and ascend up to be attached to the transverse colon. It hangs down like an apron in front of the coils of the small intestine, and it's folded back on itself to be attached to the transverse colon. It has important clinical application. This greater omentum, or it's called abdominal policeman. From this figure we can see the first of all, A is the normal greater omentum. B, we can see that the greater omentum is wrapped around, it means covering an inflamed appendix. While B, while in C, the greater omentum is folded upward toward the stomach and it's adherent to the base of a gastric ulcer. يعني هنا قاعدة موجودة في القرحة. The greater omentum, it have the ability to be adherent to the base of the gastric ulcer and it will sealing. So it is called abdominal policeman. So why we call it abdominal policeman? Because it have the ability to the localization of infection. It can act as a hernial plug, what can be used in surgery, and in addition to that, there is a problem of torsion of the greater omentum and causes a certain surgical case. The lesser omentum. The lesser omentum also, it is a double layer of peritoneum that extend in between the liver and the lesser curvature of the stomach. Can be divided into two parts. It is the same layer, but can be divided into two parts. The part that pass in between the liver and the stomach is called hepatogastric ligament, and the part that extends in between the liver and the first part of the duodenum called hepatoduodenal ligament. The lesser omentum attached from the lesser curvature of the stomach to the fissure for ligamentum venosum and the porta hepatis on the undersurface of the liver. The lesser sac يعني مثل ما شرحنا قبل قليل انه قلنا الجريتر sac قسمناه الى supracholic compartment and infracholic compartment by the presence of the attachment of the transverse mesocolon. الآن موضوعنا هو lesser sac أو omental bursa. This is space that lies behind the lesser omentum and the stomach. This space lies behind the stomach and the lesser omentum, and it extends upward as far as the diaphragm. Downward, it extends in between the two layers of the greater omentum. You can see this is the lesser sac or the omental bursa situated behind the stomach, and this is the lesser omentum. It have a left margin and it have a right margin. Left margin here, it is closed by the presence of spleen, gastrosplenic omentum or ligament, and splenorenal ligament or lienorenal ligament. So this is the left margin formed by these structures. The right margin is here, it is opened. راح يكون هنا right margin opens into the greater sac اللي هو the main part of the peritoneal cavity through the opening of the lesser sac, which is called the epiploic foramen. So this is the omental bursa, or the lesser sac is opened to the greater sac by the epiploic foramen. This is the epiploic foramen. Here we can see this is the greater sac, and this is the entrance or the foramen of Winslow to the lesser sac or the omental bursa. We can see that the lesser sac is situated behind the stomach. What are the boundaries of the omental foramen? We can see here that anteriorly this is the free border of the lesser omentum, containing the bile duct, hepatic artery, and the portal vein. This is the epiploic foramen. Posteriorly is the inferior vena cava, superiorly part of the liver, which is called caudate process of the caudate loop of the liver, and inferiorly we have the first part or the first inch of the duodenum. This is the boundaries. Here we can see this is the anterior boundary of the epiploic foramen. This is the free border of the lesser omentum containing bile duct, hepatic artery, and posteriorly the portal vein, and posterior boundary of the epiploic foramen is the inferior vena cava. Thank you. أعزائي طلبة المرحلة الثانية، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. هذه هي المحاضرة، هي تكملة محاضرة البريتونيوم. قلنا أنه البريتونيوم it have the ability to form a double layer. From these double layers it will form certain structures. في المحاضرة السابقة سميناها الأومنتا أو الأومنتم. هاي المحاضرة we have another structures that is formed by a double layer which is called the peritoneal ligaments. Peritoneal ligaments. Peritoneal ligaments are two-layered fold of peritoneum. It connects solid viscera to the abdominal walls. From its name, it is because it is a ligament, so it will connect a solid viscera to the abdominal walls. From these ligaments, these are the ligaments of the spleen. This is the spleen, and it's completely covered by peritoneum, and it have ligament to attach it to the nearby structures. From these ligaments is the gastrosplenic ligament. Gastrosplenic ligament that connect the hilum of the spleen to the stomach. Splenorenal ligament. Splenorenal ligament or the lienorenal ligament that connect the spleen to the left kidney. From this ligament also the ligaments of the liver. The ligaments of the liver also it is a double layer of peritoneum. At certain sites it will form a ligament that attach the liver to the anterior abdominal wall or to the diaphragm or to the nearby structures. These are the falciform ligament, the coronary ligament, the right and left triangular ligaments. Here we can see this is another drawing to the ligaments of the liver. This is the falciform ligament. From its lower free border we have another ligament that's called ligamentum teres hepatis. But the double layer is just the falciform ligament attaching the liver to the anterior abdominal wall and the diaphragm. And we have the coronary ligament, and the right and left extremity it will be formed by the right and left triangular ligaments. In between the layers of this is the coronary ligament, the upper layer and the lower layer, there's an area that is devoid of peritoneum, and it is called the bare area of the liver. Here the liver is in direct contact with the diaphragm, called this area also it is called the extraperitoneal space. This is the bare area of the liver in direct contact with the liver, and it is called the extraperitoneal space. Why? Because it is devoid of peritoneum. It is devoid of peritoneum. Another structure that is formed by the peritoneum is the mesenteries. Mesenteries are two-layered fold of peritoneum connecting parts of the intestine, whether it is small or large, to the posterior abdominal wall. Example on these mesentery is the mesentery of the small intestine, it's called mesentery proper, and the transverse mesocolon and the sigmoid mesocolon. This diagram showing that the embryonic origin of the mesentery we have what we call the dorsal mesentery and the ventral mesentery. The dorsal mesentery, and we can see that the blood vessel of the GI tract is passing through this mesentery from the abdominal aorta. And also we can see here how the mesentery is attaching or fixing the gut tube or different gut organs, that's the stomach, small intestine or large intestine, to the attaching it to the posterior abdominal wall, or attaching the liver to the anterior abdominal wall or to the stomach. This is one of the an important function of the mesentery is for the passage of blood vessel from the abdominal aorta to the GI tract, or in fixing the organ in position to the posterior abdominal wall. The mesentery of the small intestine. This is the small intestine, coils of small intestine. It is attached to the posterior abdominal wall by this mesentery, which is a broad, fan-shaped fold of peritoneum, connecting the coils of the jejunum and ileum to the posterior abdominal wall. Forms a natural peritoneal barrier. Here, the mesentery of the small intestine is just appear like fan shape. شكلها مثل المروحة اليدوية. And it has an important function in attaching the coils of small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. And these are the lymphatics and blood vessel passing through it. This is the mesenteries and the mesocolon. This is the transverse mesocolon. It's also a double layer of peritoneum connecting the transverse mesocolon to the posterior abdominal wall. Another mesentery that is called Mesoappendix, or the mesentery of the appendix. This is a small mesentery that also form a passageway for the blood vessel of the appendix. Mesoappendix. The sigmoid mesocolon on the mesentery of the sigmoid colon. Also, it is a double layer of peritoneum which have its roots as an inverted V shape attaching the sigmoid colon to the pelvic wall. It's a double layer of peritoneum attaching the sigmoid colon to the pelvic wall. When peritoneum reaches to a certain sites, it will undergo reflections. It will comb this reflection. It will form either recesses, spaces, pouches, or fossae. The duodenal recesses. At the duodenojejunal junction, this angle is the junction in between duodenum and the jejunum. At the duodenojejunal junction, there will be a reflection of the peritoneum, and it will form what we call recesses that lies nearby to the duodenum. These recesses can be called superior duodenal, inferior duodenal, paraduodenal, and another one called retroduodenal. These recesses that's related to the duodenum is formed near the junction of the duodenum with the beginning of the jejunum, or what is called duodenojejunal junction. Another recess that lies at the root of the sigmoid mesocolon called intersigmoid recess. It lies at the apex. This is the sigmoid mesocolon. When we reflect it upward at its apex, we have what we call the intersigmoid recess. Another recess that is formed nearby the upper and lower ileocecal folds, ileocecal folds. These are called superior and inferior ileocecal recesses. Superior and inferior ileocecal recesses. Another important recess that lies just behind or posterior to the cecum is called retrocecal recess. Retrocecal recess. This is recess, the appendix, it might lie in this retrocecal recess. Spaces. These spaces are what we call the subphrenic space. Subphrenic, it means the space that lies below the diaphragm. So subphrenic space, these are in blue color, subphrenic space. We have right and left anterior subphrenic spaces. Also, we have right posterior subphrenic space, or it's called hepatorenal recess. Hepatorenal recess, it means it's situated in between the liver and the right kidney. Hepatorenal recess. Also, as we said before, we have the right extraperitoneal space, that lies in between the bare area of the liver and the diaphragm. We call it extraperitoneal because it is devoid of peritoneum. These are the two right and left anterior subphrenic spaces situated in between the diaphragm above and the liver below. These are the right and left anterior subphrenic spaces. They lie between the diaphragm and the liver, and each one on each side of the falciform ligament. يعني راح يكون falciform ligament is in between the right and left anterior subphrenic space. The hepatorenal recess, from its name, hepatorenal, it means it lies in between the right lobe of the liver and the right kidney. This space, hepatorenal space, in between the right lobe of the liver and the right kidney. What is the importance of these spaces, يعني subphrenic spaces, our hepatorenal space? There is a continuity in between it and the paracolic gutter downward. The paracolic gutter downward. The paracolic gutters. The paracolic gutters معناها أنه in this region lie on the lateral and medial sides of the ascending and descending colon. It means on both sides of the colon. Paracolic. Gutters معناها أعتقد المنحدر. The paracolic gutters lie on the lateral and medial side of the ascending and descending colon respectively. مثل ما قلنا أنه subphrenic spaces and the paracolic gutters are clinically important. Why? Because there is a continuity in between them, because they may be a site for the collection and movement of infected peritoneal fluids. قاعد نشوف هنا هذا هو descending colon، هذا هو ascending with descending colon, and we have this site of reflection of peritoneum covering the colon. This on the medial and right side of the colon, on the medial and lateral side of the ascending colon, we have this angle that is called the paracolic gutters. The paracolic gutters, and there is a continuity with of this paracolic gutter, a continuity with the subphrenic spaces, and there is chance for the movement of fluid, of infected fluid, from the subphrenic spaces to the paracolic gutters. What are the folds and fossae of the anterior abdominal wall that is formed by the reflection of peritoneum or certain structures on the anterior abdominal wall? First of all, at the midline, we have what we call the median umbilical fold to contain the remnant of urachus. And this fold is called the median, it means at the midline, median umbilical ligament, or median umbilical ligament is formed by the median umbilical fold. Lateral to it, another fold is called medial umbilical fold. Medial umbilical fold. Medial umbilical fold contains the remnants of the umbilical arteries. Umbilical arteries, طبعا remnants of umbilical arteries, it is fibrous, and it is called the medial umbilical ligaments. These remnants are called medial umbilical ligaments, but the fold is called medial umbilical fold. The most lateral one, this one is called the lateral umbilical fold, and this lateral umbilical fold contains the inferior epigastric vessels. Inferior epigastric vessels. So these fold at the midline, we have the median umbilical fold formed by the urachus, medial umbilical fold formed by remnants of umbilical arteries, and the lateral umbilical fold formed by the inferior epigastric vessels. inferior epigastric vessels. هذه هنا إعادة إلها إنه هذا هو median umbilical fold, medial umbilical fold, and the lateral umbilical fold. Lateral umbilical fold is formed by the inferior epigastric vessels originating from the external iliac vessel, and the medial umbilical fold is formed by the remnant of the umbilical arteries, and the median umbilical fold formed by a remnant of urachus that have a connection with the urinary bladder. In between these folds we have what we call the fossae. راح تكون هنا in between the lateral and medial we have the medial umbilical fossa, and then another fossa in between the medial and the median is called supravesical fossa. Pouches. Another forms of spaces that is formed by reflection of peritoneal layer on certain organs, what we call the pouches. In female, we have what we call the rectouterine pouch. Rectouterine pouch. Here, the peritoneum covering the rectum, it will be reflected on the posterior surface of the uterus, and this space is formed by the it will form the rectouterine pouch, or it is known as the rectouterine pouch, in between the rectum and the uterus. While anterior to the uterus, here the peritoneum will be reflected on the superior surface of the urinary bladder. This is called the vesicouterine pouch. Vesicouterine pouch. While in male we have just one pouch that's called rectovesical pouch. This is in male. This is the rectovesical pouch. Rectovesical pouch between the rectum and the urinary bladder. While in female we have the rectouterine pouch between rectum and uterus, and we have the vesicouterine pouch that lies in between the urinary bladder and the uterus. Because the peritoneal cavity regarded as the most extensive cavity in the body, we can use this cavity for dialysis, for peritoneal, what we call the peritoneal dialysis. Another important issue is that this peritoneal cavity, in certain pathological condition, it might contain plenty of fluid, an abnormal collection of fluid, and this abnormal collection of fluid is called ascites, and this ascites, it might be drained through the anterior abdominal wall. Thank you.